Yeah, thanks everyone for letting me come and talk to you. I know many of you, but yes, as Rob said, I have been working around wetlands and looking at their role in treatment and other treatment systems in the Vertican and elsewhere around the reef catchments. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that a lot of what I'll be presenting today is a bit of a synthesis of a range of research that's been done throughout Queensland on the nitrogen removal performance of wetlands, natural and constructed. And much of it's been done by Fernanda Adame, who's a wetland ecologist at Griffith University, who studies the biochemical and different nutrient processes occurring in wetland systems. So thanks to her for much of the information. But firstly, I wanted to start off with my trusty sponge. I want to talk about, I don't know about you, but when you're washing your car, I like to have a sponge that, is pretty absorbent, got lots of suds and lots of water, so it makes the job quicker and better. But what would happen, do you think, if we take away half that sponge? We just have half a sponge left. What do you think that's going to do to the absorption? How much water you can absorb in this, and the way you can clean your car? So if we think of that similarly to with our wetlands in our catchments, what if we remove half the wetlands out of our catchments? What do you think that's going to do in terms of the ability of these wetland systems to hold and absorb water, treat nutrients, and also provide things like fish habitat or habitat for other wildlife? Well, unfortunately, many of the catchments, coastal catchments throughout Queensland have lost up to half of their wetlands, including parts of the lower Vertican. So we wonder what sort of impact that's having on the ability of our catchments to actually slow water flows and treat runoff. But I guess I want to talk to you today about how can we actually return some of those functions in our landscapes. So firstly, I just wanted to say that like sponges, we've got sponges for different reasons, same as wetlands. So not all wetlands do everything. So some wetlands can potentially be better for, say, nutrient removal, other wetlands better for fish habitat. And so it's really important to understand, well, what are we actually looking at trying to achieve here? And so the Queensland Wetlands Program has developed this whole system values-based framework. It's very busy, I understand, but basically just wanted to bring that to your attention, that there is a framework that's been developed to try and set out how you can develop an understanding of the system, about what parts of the what's happening in terms of processes like the water flows, as well as nutrient processes, as well as the different components, what plants and animals you have in a system, to then work out, well, what do we actually want to achieve from a particular given management activity. So whether that's, do you want a wetland managed for fish habitat or do you want it for nutrient management? And that's really important to then determine, well, what would we actually do in that situation? So a lot of the focus today is around water quality. And so if you're looking to manage a system for water quality improvement, as we've seen, there's a lot of things you can do around best management practice, extension, engagement activities. But I guess what I'm sort of focusing in on in this presentation is how do we manage existing wetlands through, say, systems repair type activities, or how do we actually engineer wetlands to achieve that goal specific to water quality and particularly nitrogen removal. So we have to get then, if we want to remove nitrogen specifically, we've come to that, that's our objective. We need to understand how nitrogen moves in the landscape. This is a model developed, it's available on the Wetland Info website, and it's a conceptual model of nitrogen dynamics for the Great Barrier Reef catchment specifically. So I'm not going to go into all of that, but I just wanted to highlight, be talking a bit about dissolved inorganic nitrogen, and by that, that's a combination of ammonium nitrate and nitrite, and also talking a bit about atmospheric nitrogen, so nitrous oxide and nitrogen gas. So they're the main ones, and that I'll be referring to, but there's a whole lot of other stuff going on in terms of nitrogen processing. But really the main process when we're wanting to remove nitrogen from a system, the main thing we're looking at is the process of denitrification. This actually takes the nitrogen out of the water and removes it to inert nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. So the recipe for that is that we need some denitrifying bacteria, we need a source of carbon, we need the nitrate, and also we need an environment where there's low oxygen in contact with some oxygenated areas and warm temperature, which we have that in often up here, except not so much in the room this morning. So what we need to the recipe for making that happen is firstly the nitrification step, which is taking the ammonia to nitrate, and then from the nitrate there's a series of steps to reduce that to inert nitrogen gas called denitrification. So I'll be mentioning denitrification quite a lot. But where does that actually happen? Like, what are the conditions that support that denitrification process? So a study up in Cardwell Barrett's Lagoon looked at a natural lagoon system and where the denitrification was happening in that system to understand what conditions do we need for that to occur. So they had open water sort of body in the middle, where there was this rocky substrate, not too much denitrification happening there, but the main denitrification was occurring in the vegetated edges and particularly in the soils beneath the plants. There was also the slimes that grow on the plant stems, called the epiphyton, or biofilms, you might hear of it called. There was denitrification occurring there because you've got some low oxygen environment with some oxygenated areas close by, but really it's the soils that are rich in carbon, you've got the plant roots introducing little pockets of oxygen and otherwise low oxygen environment, and that's where you're getting large amounts of denitrification occurring. Similarly, there was other studies done in Melaleuca swamps in the wet tropics. They looked at, well, as a wetland in its entirety, where is that nitrogen actually being processed? So there was some going into the soil and some being accumulated in the biomass, and the plant was taking it up. But by far, the greatest amount of nitrogen lost out of that system was through denitrification, with a total of 590 kilos per hectare per year of nitrogen being removed from the wetlands.
You're talking volatilisation?
That's another process as well, yeah. So that really highlights that denitrification is key. But at the same time, we want to make sure that there's not sort of adverse impacts happening. If you don't get full denitrification, there can be some nitrous oxide emissions. That is a very potent greenhouse gas, as is methane that can be released in some wetland systems. So they did a study down in southeast Queensland looking at the emissions from cane and ponded pasture, as well as restored wetlands and natural wetlands. And they found that, yes, if you are to convert some areas into wetlands, you're not going to be causing increased greenhouse gas emissions. And just bring to your attention, there's recently been a blue carbon methodology released for reintroducing tidal waters into areas where it's been cut off previously for that very reason, that there is a reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions. So now we understand that denitrification is a key process for actually taking nitrogen out of water. But how can we actually build wetlands to mimic what is happening naturally in our wetland systems? So these graphs are taken from work done in the Tully Johnson and the major integrated projects up there, where they built treatment wetlands. There were 4 treatment wetlands studied in this one, and 3 out of the 4 showed denitrification potential, but 1 didn't. And so they looked at, well, what was it about that wetland? And it had only recently been built. It didn't have that the low oxygen environment in the soil hadn't developed, and they think maybe the microbial community needed for the denitrification hadn't quite established yet. So that's where we're saying that where you're building sort of wetland from scratch, digging out an area that probably you're not going to see much for the first 12 months perhaps. But really the aim of showing this is that in the vegetated scenarios versus the unvegetated scenarios, you had removal of ammonium and nitrate, but not when it was not vegetated. So really the key message that we found repeatedly is that vegetation is key in these systems. We also recently completed a synthesis looking at 14 different treatment wetlands throughout Queensland, including the BIFMAC one in the Lower Burdekin. And overall, it identified that given the right location, the right design and management, that treatment wetlands can reduce dissolved inorganic nitrogen by up to 80%. There were 8 wetlands on farms, 2 vegetated drains on farms, and then 4 wetlands that were treating effluent that have been through the sewage treatment plant. And that's interesting about the study is the huge variability in the amount of nitrogen removed from the different sites. But it did provide an opportunity then to look into what makes some wetlands better than others. And if we look at just 2 of those examples, so CW1 was one of the major integrated project wetlands near Marillion, and there was 370 kilograms of dissolved inorganic nitrogen per hectare per year removed from that. And we undertook a cost effectiveness analysis that showed that of a cost of around $23 per kilogram of dissolved inorganic nitrogen removed from that system, so it can be quite cost effective. So the key thing about this site is the shape of the wetland, long and thin, so channeling the water through when they had more than half of it was vegetated, so the water's evenly going through the vegetation, but also it had groundwater coming in too, so sort of a more steady flow of water coming through into that treatment system. And yeah, you can see there the reduction between the inflow and outflow. So we looked at inflow and outflow as well as some sites look at denitrification potential, and the big one was then trying to quantify flow from these systems as well to actually understand what's the load reductions. And so the other site I'm showing here is the proof of concept BIFMAC treatment wetland, and this came in around 7th, like midway, in terms of the cost effectiveness. There was around 41 kilos of dissolved inorganic nitrogen per hectare per year removed there. But what was interesting about this one was proved more cost effective for total nitrogen removal. So in looking into this site, so as I said before, all sites are really different, it's very site specific stuff and what's happening. But in this, there was actually quite relatively high total suspended solids in the water flowing in, and actually the nitrate concentrations were relatively low, one of the lowest of all the sites we looked at. So what's happening here is it's not removing as much DIN because there's not as much to remove, as opposed to this site, which had a consistent of about 0.7 of a milligram per litre of nitrate. This was 0.2. So really it's about there was a real association between the influent concentration and the amount of nitrate removed, and that really affected the cost effectiveness of those systems. So highlighting the importance of site selection. And so thanks to Terrain and BIFMAC for providing that data. So what we've really found is summarised here, and basically that vegetation makes a big difference to these systems. if we start off, this is what I guess different scenarios look like. This is a newly established wetland in Mackay. You've got a big open water body in the middle, some sort of vegetation just on the edges. And so this is kind of, there's still removal happening, but it's more around the sediment removal. It's acting a bit like a sediment basin in this scenario. You're having higher oxygen levels here. You're getting sediment dropping out. You can even have nitrification occurring where it's converting ammonium to nitrate, but then the nitrate's not getting denitrified. So you might actually see an increase in nitrate from that system when you don't have the established vegetation. But I'll show you. So this photo, the second one here, we can see more dense vegetation, reeds and sedges. This is where you're actually seeing that nitrification and the denitrification occurring. Lower oxygen levels, particularly down the bottom where you, in your soils and adjacent to the soils, and you're actually getting reduction in nitrate in that scenario. And then if we sort of let it go, no maintenance, dominated by weeds, then you can actually get other things going on where the oxygen is so low that you can't get the nitrification. So you get some denitrification occurring, but you can also have some adverse effects such as methane emissions from this scenario. So it's really about, if we're looking at wetlands, they need to be vegetated, but they need to be managed as well. And that's what we're really aiming for. So from all this work, we've now been able to figure out what are the conditions required to actually build wetlands that will remove nitrogen. So we're looking at, we need to have the nitrate concentration, we're saying about 0.4 milligram per litre or higher for cost-effective nitrate removal. We need to have vegetation at least half, covering at least half the wetland. The soil organic carbon is important, as is neutral pH. And the shape is also important, so you kind of want longer rather than wider. You don't really want a round wetland if you can just get preferential flow paths through there. So shape's important, as is the water flow, so that you're having slow flow, you've got more time for that water to be in contact with the vegetation and for that denitrification to occur. And also we found that, like in the case of the BIFMAC wetland and a couple of others, where there was higher total suspended solids, there was actually lower nitrate removal. So having what we call a treatment train effect, where you might have a sediment basin. There was a sediment basin as part of that BIFMAC wetland as well. But what we're thinking might be happening in that situation to have those low nitrate levels in the inflow is that the vegetated drains upstream that were very long, extensive and quite well vegetated drains feeding into the wetland, that's probably where a lot of this removal was actually occurring. So if you can meet these criteria, then treatment of wetlands can actually be a cost-effective way to help complement the other work that's been undertaken in terms of agronomic best management practices to help further reduce the nitrogen entering the creeks. And so what can we do with this information? Can we return some of this wetland water quality function that we've lost from our catchments? Well, yes, we can. We found if you locate the wetlands well, if they're designed well and managed. So what you can really do as part of your farm plans, maybe look at, well, can treatment wetlands or vegetated drains or other things be incorporated into the farming system? And how can we maybe manage our drains differently to actually promote some of this vegetation and the denitrification that comes with that? So we looked at a couple of the vegetated drains in that study, and it's promising. We need some more research into the role of vegetated drains, but it appears that they're acting as like linear wetlands in in the catchments, and then if we can manage our drains to sort of slow the water down a bit, interact with vegetation, keep the vegetation in the base, that actually the drains can actually be doing a good job and provide those conditions necessary for denitrification. So it's something we want to look at into a bit further. And how can we find out more information about this stuff? So Wetland Info is a website that's got a lot of information around a range of different treatment systems. And also I worked with Herbert Kane Productivity Services to put together some fact sheets for extension officers about how you might look at assessing a farm's suitability for treatment wetlands or other treatment systems.
Carla, if you get a weed infestation,
Yep.
What the determine what the weed is, obviously there's certain weeds that are beneficial. So, if you do get that, you're not going to use a pesticide to control the weed.
But there are,
It's just, does it make sense to spray pesticide in a wetland?
yes, it depends what, coming back to your objectives, if it's about, say, fish habitat or ecological purposes, I think a lot of weed spraying occurs to keep water bodies open if it's for fish passage and other things. So it comes back to firstly what you want to achieve from that wetland. If you are wanting to do it for treatment purposes, so a lot of the things that we do tend to control for are the introduced pasture grasses, so your hymenacne and your paragrass. So you can use a selective herbicide. Verdict, and generally what, if you have to use something, a selective one, because they don't tend to kill those sedges that are sort of what we're kind of trying to encourage in a lot of these systems. But it does still, like paragrass in patches, as long as it doesn't take over and cause stagnant water, the paragrass will remove pasture as well. And hymenacne, yeah.
Because that takes over a lot of those.
Yeah, so that's where those sort of grass selective herbicides can be.
I did some of the council, that the pest management meeting, they're actually putting like valid equivalent tablets straight in water to control this. Yeah, but then they're still trying to check it. So I think, like Carl said, it depends on what the purpose is. And I think that's to good enough.
Yeah, so it's about being clear what you're wanting from the actual system that you're trying to manage. Yeah, because the way you might manage for fish will be quite different to managing nitrogen removals.